The shadow you refuse to see. Carl Jung once described a patient who terrified him, not because the man was violent, but because he was good. At least on the surface, he was respected, polite, disciplined, and deeply moral, the kind of person everyone trusted instinctively. But Jung noticed something disturbing. The more this man spoke about virtue, the more tension appeared underneath his behavior. There were tiny cracks: passive aggression, disguised as politeness, quiet enjoyment when discussing people who had failed, a strange obsession with controlling how others perceived him. Jung eventually realized something dangerous. The man wasn't free from darkness. He was hiding from it so completely that it had started controlling him unconsciously. That realization became one of Jung's most unsettling conclusions about human nature. The qualities people reject in themselves don't disappear, they go underground, and from there they begin shaping personality from the shadows. Most people never notice this happening, because the mind is designed to protect identity before truth. If you believe you are the nice person, your mind will hide every emotion that contradicts that image. Jealousy becomes concern. Control becomes care. Manipulation becomes love. Weakness becomes kindness. The mask stays clean, but underneath it, pressure builds. That's why some of the most emotionally dangerous people aren't openly cruel, they're unconscious. People don't resent your weakness, they resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. And unconscious resentment is one of the darkest forces in human behavior. The cost of growing past others. You can feel this in subtle moments when someone acts supportive, but their energy shifts after your success. When a friend slowly withdraws once you become more confident. When people seem to like you more while you were insecure, confused, and dependent. A weaker version of you created psychological safety for others. And the moment you begin changing, something strange happens. You start seeing hidden motives everywhere. Not because humanity suddenly grew darker, but because awareness removed the filter. Eventually, that awareness turns inward. You begin noticing things about yourself you'd spent years avoiding. How often your kindness was really fear of rejection. How often your silence was fear of conflict. How often your morality depended entirely on whether temptation happened to be available. That's the moment the shadow first appears, not as evil, but as a form of honesty so sharp that it becomes impossible to return to your old self afterward. Once a person truly sees the hidden motives beneath their own behavior, they start seeing them in everyone else too. Most people assume self-awareness brings peace. It doesn't at first. It makes life uncomfortable. Because the moment you recognize the shadow inside yourself, you start noticing how much of human interaction is driven by unconscious need. The need for approval, for power, for superiority, for feeling emotionally necessary to someone. Ordinary conversations stop feeling ordinary. You notice how people subtly test each other for status. How groups instinctively punish anyone who changes too fast. How some friendships survive only because one person stays smaller, and most people aren't doing this consciously, which is what makes it unsettling. The human mind hides its darker motives even from itself. A person can genuinely believe they love you, while quietly resenting your freedom. They can support you publicly while competing with you privately. They can help you while secretly needing you to stay broken enough to need them back. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. Why the shadow leaks. Jung believed the shadow becomes dangerous when it stays unconscious, not because darkness itself is evil, but because denied darkness mutates. Anything rejected by the conscious mind searches for another exit. That's why people who suppress anger often become passive-aggressive. People who deny selfishness become controlling helpers. And people obsessed with appearing pure often turn cruel in subtle ways. The shadow always leaks, usually through emotion first. Overreaction, jealousy, possessiveness. Sudden hostility toward certain people, for reasons that don't fully make sense, especially toward people who embody traits we secretly abandoned in ourselves. Confidence irritates insecure people. Freedom irritates controlled people. Authenticity irritates performers. Nowhere is this more visible than in social groups. Every group unconsciously creates rules about who you're allowed to become. At first, those rules feel invisible, but the moment you start changing, becoming more disciplined, more attractive, more emotionally detached, less willing to tolerate disrespect, people react differently to you. Not openly, but subtly. The jokes get sharper, the support gets quieter, the warmth becomes conditional, because transformation disrupts psychological balance. Your growth forces people to confront their own stagnation, and many would rather pull you backward than question themselves. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. That's why meeting your shadow changes your social life permanently. You stop seeing people only through their words, and start seeing patterns. Who disappears when you improve? Who grows uncomfortable when you set boundaries? Who only feels safe around a weaker version of you? But the darkest realization comes later, when you recognize those same patterns inside yourself. If you're honest enough, you notice something painful. Part of you also wanted people beneath you. Part of you enjoyed being needed, being admired, being emotionally important. Even suffering can become identity. Some people don't heal, because their pain gives them psychological leverage. Victimhood can create control. Weakness can attract attention. Fragility can manipulate protection from others without ever asking directly. The shadow is rarely dramatic. It's subtle, which is why most people never meet it. They spend their entire lives protecting an image of themselves that feels safer than the truth. But truth has a strange property once seen clearly. It reshapes your entire perception of reality. Seeing what's underneath after a certain point, you stop reacting to people the same way. Not because you become emotionless, but because you begin understanding what's underneath the emotion. Someone insults you publicly. Before, you might have seen arrogance. Now you see insecurity searching for relief. Someone constantly needs attention. Before, it looked like confidence. Now you see emptiness trying to avoid silence. Someone tries to control everyone around them. Before, it looked like strength. Now you see fear disguised as authority. The shadow changes how you interpret behavior. Human interaction starts to feel less personal and more psychological, and that's the disturbing part. You realize most people aren't fully interacting with reality. They're interacting with unresolved parts of themselves. A man abandoned emotionally as a child becomes obsessed with respect. A woman betrayed repeatedly becomes addicted to control. A person humiliated for years becomes hypersensitive to criticism. Eventually, personalities begin forming around wounds rather than truth around compensation. That's why some people become addicted to superiority. They're trying to escape old feelings of powerlessness. Others become addicted to being desired, trying to prove they're no longer invisible. Some become addicted to moral purity, because deep down they fear what they're capable of. The shadow often grows strongest in the people who claim they've transcended it, which is why Jung distrusted excessive innocence. Anyone who constantly needs to appear good is usually fighting something internally. Real self-awareness makes people quieter, less performative. Because once you truly see your own capacity for manipulation, envy, cruelty, and ego, judging others becomes more complicated, not softer, just more honest. You begin realizing morality is often circumstantial. Many people are good simply because life never gave them the right temptation. Remove consequences, remove social judgment, remove risk, And human nature changes quickly in darkness. Civilization is thinner than people think, and beneath it, ancient instincts still breathe. Competition, dominance, possession, violence, submission. The modern personality is often just a refined mask, stretched over primitive impulses. That realization can alter the way you see society forever. Especially once you notice how often human relationships revolve around unconscious transactions: attention traded for validation, loyalty traded for security, love traded for emotional certainty. Very little is unconditional, and the mind hates admitting this, because people want to believe their emotions are pure. But the shadow reveals how mixed human motives truly are. Even generosity can hide ego. Even sacrifice can hide control. Even love can hide fear. Sometimes people don't miss you, they miss access to the version of themselves they felt around you. That's why losing certain relationships changes people so violently. It forces them to confront emotional dependencies they mistook for connection. The distance that comes with awareness once you begin seeing these dynamics clearly. Loneliness changes too. You stop feeling isolated because people misunderstand you, and start realizing most people misunderstand themselves. That creates a strange emotional distance from society, not superiority. Just distance, because you begin noticing how many conversations are performances, how many identities are constructed for survival, how many smiles are negotiations. The shadow strips away illusions slowly, not all at once, which is why the process feels psychologically exhausting. You are grieving versions of reality that once comforted you. At some point, the process becomes impossible to reverse. You can no longer fully participate in illusions you once depended on. Compliments start sounding strategic. Certain friendships start feeling transactional. Even attraction reveals hidden power dynamics underneath it. You notice how often people fall in love with potential instead of reality. How some relationships survive only because both people agree to avoid honesty. How entire social circles are built around mutual performance. The unsettling part is this: most people know, at least unconsciously, that awareness threatens stability, so they keep acting. That's why society quietly rewards predictable identities: the reliable friend, the peaceful one, the successful one, the broken one, the caretaker, the rebel. Once people become comfortable with your role, changing it creates resistance. Not because they hate you, but because your transformation disrupts their psychological map of reality. The version of you they understood begins disappearing, and humans grow uncomfortable when they lose certainty about someone, especially when that someone stops behaving in emotionally convenient ways. A person who suddenly develops boundaries is often accused of becoming cold. A quiet person who gains confidence is called arrogant. Someone who stops tolerating disrespect is labeled difficult, because people prefer predictable suffering over unpredictable change. The shadow teaches you something brutal. A large part of social acceptance depends on how non-threatening your evolution feels to others. That's why many people unconsciously stay weak. Weakness maintains belonging, while transformation risks isolation. Jung believed this was one of the greatest psychological fears human beings carry. Not fear of death, but fear of becoming psychologically separate from the group. For thousands of years, exclusion meant a risk to survival. And that instinct still lives inside modern people. Which explains why so many betray themselves to maintain approval. They suppress opinions, ambition, anger, individuality, not consciously, but automatically. The personality adapts for survival long before awareness arrives. Eventually, though, the suppressed parts begin demanding recognition. That's when the shadow appears in dreams, impulses, fantasies, and sudden emotional reactions, the psyche fighting to become whole again. This is where most people turn away, because meeting the shadow feels humiliating. You realize you were never as selfless as you imagined, never as emotionally independent as you claimed, never as morally consistent as you wanted to believe. Selfish motives are hiding beneath generosity, control hiding beneath affection, ego hiding beneath intelligence. Even pain can become vanity some people grow attached to, suffering, because it makes them feel unique, while others stay trapped in chaos, because stability would force them to confront who they are without the drama. The mind can turn almost anything into identity, including destruction. That's why certain people sabotage relationships the moment intimacy becomes real chaos, feels familiar, and peace feels suspicious. The buried strength, the shadow, doesn't only contain darkness. It also contains buried strength, aggression, confidence, creativity, sexual energy, ambition, traits many people were taught to suppress to remain acceptable. Some people aren't weak by nature. They were conditioned into psychological obedience. The moment those buried traits begin returning, their entire personality changes, not softer, but more dangerous. Because integrated people stop needing constant validation. They stop apologizing for existing. They stop shrinking themselves for comfort. They stop confusing self-erasure with kindness. And society reacts strongly to people who no longer need permission to become themselves. That's the paradox Jung understood better than most people ever will. The shadow isn't destroyed through denial. It's transformed through confrontation. Because the parts of yourself you refuse to face don't become weaker, they become autonomous, acting without your awareness. That's why some people explode after years of being calm, why certain individuals become consumed by addictions they once judged in others, why people betray their own values in moments they later barely recognize. The shadow always collects interest, especially in people obsessed with appearing morally superior. There is something deeply unsettling about individuals who never admit darkness inside themselves, not because they're pure, but because repression creates pressure, and pressure eventually seeks release. History is full of people who committed horrifying acts while believing they were righteous. That's the danger of unconsciousness. The human mind can justify almost anything if identity depends on it. Cruelty becomes justice. Control becomes protection. Possession becomes love. Obsession becomes loyalty. The ego is an extraordinary storyteller. It rewrites motives to protect self-image. That's why genuine self-awareness is rare. Most people don't want truth. They want emotional comfort disguised as truth. Real awareness destabilizes identity. And identity is one of the strongest addictions humans possess. People cling to their self-concept even when it destroys them: the victim, the savior, the intellectual, the misunderstood one, the good person. These identities become psychological shelters. Without them, many people no longer know who they are, so they defend the role at all costs, sometimes even unconsciously creating situations that reinforce it. A person addicted to victimhood will repeatedly choose environments where they feel mistreated. A person addicted to superiority will constantly search for weaker people. A person addicted to chaos will sabotage peace the moment it appears. Patterns, not fate. The shadow shapes destiny more than most people realize, not through fate, but through repetition. Unconscious people repeat the same emotional patterns until awareness interrupts them. Different faces, different environments, the same psychological script. Eventually you begin seeing this everywhere. Families passing trauma through behavior instead of words. Children inheriting emotional wounds their parents never confronted. Entire relationships functioning as exchanges of unresolved pain. People often marry their unconscious patterns before they ever understand themselves. That's why attraction can feel irrational. Sometimes you're not drawn to someone because they're healthy for you, you're drawn to them Because they match a wound your nervous system already recognizes. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace. Once you understand this, the entire idea of love begins to change. You stop asking who makes me feel intense emotions and start asking what part of me is reacting. That question alone can dismantle years of illusion. Because intense chemistry isn't always connection, sometimes it's recognition between two unresolved shadows. Two people unconsciously trying to complete unfinished psychological stories through each other. The tragic part is that most people never realize it. They call it fate, soulmates, passion, while unconsciously repeating cycles they secretly hoped would save them. The shadow changes how you see romance, friendship, ambition, morality, even yourself. But eventually the deepest realization arrives. Not all darkness is destructive. Some darkness is necessary. Without aggression, you cannot protect yourself. Without ego, you cannot maintain identity. Without anger, boundaries collapse. Without ambition, potential dies quietly inside comfort. The goal was never purity. Purity is psychologically dangerous. The goal is integration. Because a conscious shadow is far less dangerous than an unconscious mask pretending to be light. What changes after that realization? Something inside you becomes quieter, not happier. Quieter. You stop obsessing over appearing good all the time. You stop needing constant reassurance that you're different from everyone else. You stop dividing humanity into heroes and monsters, because the line between them is thinner than most people can emotionally tolerate. Under the right conditions, almost anyone is capable of cruelty. Under the right conditions, almost anyone is capable of betrayal. Under the right conditions, almost anyone can become someone they once judged. That understanding changes the way you move through the world. You become slower to idolize people, slower to trust appearances, slower to mistake confidence for character. Because you now understand something most people avoid seeing. Human beings are masters of presentation. A smile can hide resentment. Charm can hide manipulation. Intelligence can hide emptiness. Empathy can hide control. The shadow taught you this not through theory, but through observation. Through noticing how often people say one thing while emotionally communicating another. Someone claims they support you, but subtly competes with you. Someone claims they love you, but slowly diminishes your individuality. Someone claims they want honesty, until honesty threatens their self-image. Eventually you realize most people don't fear darkness, they fear exposure. Exposure destroys psychological certainty. It forces confrontation with contradictions the ego spent years burying. That's why people become defensive. When accurately understood, being seen deeply is psychologically invasive. Especially for those who spent their lives constructing identities designed to avoid themselves. But once you meet your own shadow, you lose the desire to completely condemn others for theirs. Not because accountability disappears, but because arrogance does. You recognize the same machinery inside yourself, the same ego, the same hunger, the same insecurity. The same primitive impulses hiding beneath sophistication. Civilized behavior is often just negotiated instinct. That realization humbles you in a strange way, not morally, but existentially. You stop seeing yourself as separate from human nature and realize you are human nature, capable of generosity and destruction, love and possession, wisdom and self-deception at the same time. Maybe that's the real reason most people avoid shadow work, not because it reveals darkness, but because it dissolves certainty. Certainty about who you are, certainty about others, certainty about morality itself. The shadow dismantles simplistic thinking. Good people can become dangerous, brainless. Broken people can become wise. Kindness can conceal manipulation. Anger can conceal truth. Nothing remains psychologically clean anymore. And that ambiguity exhausts people. Most would rather live inside comforting illusions than carry the weight of complexity. But once awareness begins, the process rarely stops. You begin noticing how much of society runs on suppression, suppressed aggression, turning into online hatred, suppressed loneliness, turning into addiction, suppressed insecurity turning into an obsession with status, suppressed meaning turning into endless distraction. Modern life offers infinite ways to avoid yourself: noise, entertainment, validation, consumption, anything to prevent silence, because silence eventually forces confrontation. Deep down, many people are terrified of what they might discover if they ever stop distracting themselves long enough to look inward. That fear shapes entire lives. Some people stay constantly busy because stillness reveals emptiness. Some stay in toxic relationships because loneliness reveals dependency. Some chase endless attention because invisibility feels psychologically unbearable. And beneath all of it, the shadow waits patiently, not as an enemy, but as the unfinished part of the self, demanding recognition. It's the part that refuses to disappear no matter how carefully the mask is maintained. Because no mask survives forever. Eventually life removes it through betrayal, failure, loss, success, love, isolation. Something always reveals the truth underneath. And when that day comes, most people will spend their lives trying to rebuild the mask. A few will choose something far more dangerous. They will finally look at themselves honestly. And once a person truly sees themselves clearly, the world never looks human in the same way again.